this afternoon, Alain Aspect. He's a famous physicist about whom there is an awful lot to say. This is, of course, best done by a physicist, not by a mathematician as I am. So I'd like to ask my CENPI colleague, Jean-Claude Garot from the Laboratoire Flamme, to introduce our speaker.
So the organizers asked me to present Alain Aspect. This is a hard task that will be probably unnecessary. We're all physicists here, but I will take as an excuse the fact that there are also mathematicians and try to say a few words. So Alain has been on the first row of physics for quite a long time now, and has received many distinctions. I will cite just a few ones. He is a member of the Académie des Sciences. He received also prestigious prizes like the Einstein Medal, the Wolf Prize, and the CNRS Gold Medal. And his group at the Institut Optique has produced many interesting and frontline results. I will cite just a few ones. In recent years, they translate, for example, what can be considered as the founding experiment of quantum optics, the Hamburg-Brown and Twist experiment from quantum optics to atom optics. And this is a very new kind of physics, very interesting kind of physics with, for example, condensates and Fermi gases. And more recently, they also produced a very interesting realization of the famous Anderson model, which is the model that describes the effects of the world on quantum mechanics. Which has a few examples. And Alain had so very large choice of subjects to talk about today. And the two big from Einstein to Rita with particularity for a single particle. So we'll talk about one of the another of his remarkable experiments, which is the observation of fringes, interference fringes with single photons. And I'll let him explain that himself. I would just like to, before he starts to present you this fascinating subject, to thank him to be here today, to have accepted our invitation to come here today and talk to you. So, thank you.
It's my turn to thank the organizers for inviting me in front of such a selected public audience. And the subject I'm going to talk today, I started this, I'm afraid to say, more than 3 decades ago. It was my first scientific life. My first scientific life was about quantum optics with photons, which makes sense. Quantum optics is adequate with photons. But in the last decade, as you mentioned, we are rather doing quantum optics with atoms, but I like to go back to these basic experiments in quantum optics. And what I'm going to talk here is, can you turn off this microphone, which makes a lot, and this one is here. It's enough, okay. This one should be switched off. Okay, thank you. Yes, so this, according to Feynman, one of the 2 great mysteries of quantum mechanics, and maybe at the end, if I am not too long, you will hear about the second great mystery of quantum mechanics. But this one is the simplest, strange, amazing, bizarre behavior that you can observe in the quantum world. So you recognize, of course, this gentleman, Albert Einstein. I love presenting Albert Einstein as he was when he was young in 1901 in Bern. He was an employee of the Bureau of Patents. And this is John Archibald Wheeler, who passed away recently, but who was a deep thinker, a great theorist, a deep thinker, and in particular about quantum physics. And if you want to know the details of the calculation, you can buy this book. I will have some royalties. And if you show me that you have bought the book, I can pay you a beer. If you So, what is the nature of light? This equation that people have asked, or thinkers have asked for millennia. And in the antiquity, for instance, I like very much this stela that you can, it's an Egyptian stela that you can find in the Louvre in Paris. And you see that they represent the light going from the sun to the observer here, down Tapre. And it is made of flowers with many different colors. If you want to push a little bit, you can think that it's not so far from Newton, who showed that light is made of different colors, and in addition, Newton thought that light was made of particles, so why not? What is interesting about antiquity is that when you look a little more in details, there are 2 points of view. In one point of view, like this one, light starts from the object and goes to your eye. But there was another point of view that we would call in modern terms a lidar or a radar. That is something, it's leaving your eye, going to the object and coming back to bring you the information. Of course, they have no idea, no experimental observation, but it was by thinking that this model. In the Middle Age and Renaissance, it seems that there were less thinkers, but there were engineers. And then inventing things like the viewing glasses, and many of you can appreciate how it can make your life comfortable, especially when you get older and older, you know, and with viewing glass, it's better, or for short-sighted people. And so they invented corrective glasses, telescope, microscope, etc. It was a time of engineering, and we should not underestimate engineering. Then in the 17th century, Huygens came with a theory that light is waves, and it was a very nice theory, and it was by analogy with the rings that you have in water when you throw a stone in water. But unfortunately for Huygens, there was a giant who took an opposite point of view, Newton. Newton defended the particle-like model of light, and Newton was obviously a genius. He has a scientific authority such that the model of Newton, was prominent, because everybody knows he has done the gravitational gravitation universal gravitation, explain motion of planets. In addition, his experiments in optics are wonderful. Newton was a great experimentalist in optics, and so his model, by an argument of authority, really was the winner, and it was a winner for more than 1 century, until at the beginning of the 19th century, 2 real geniuses, 2 giants, Young on the other side of the channel and Fresnel on this side of the channel, developed by a full theory of light represented by waves. And by a full theory, I mean that they were able to describe all experiments you know about light. They could observe interference, diffraction, the effect of birefringent crystals, etc. If you download the Mémoire of Fresnel on the site of the Académie des Sciences, you can download his memoir. There is nothing to change for describing the optics that we know today. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And so it was clear that it was a wave, but nobody knew what was the nature of the wave. And the other genius, immense genius, who elucidated this point is Maxwell. Maxwell, writing his equation, finding that a solution of this partial differential equation is a wave propagating at 300,000 kilometers per second, and at that time they knew the value of the velocity of light, which had been measured by astronomical measurement. Maxwell, you have to read the book of the original book of Maxwell, you know, very British. You know. You see, one cannot help noticing the equal value of my hypothetical waves with a known value of the velocity of light. So after Maxwell, we know that light is an electromagnetic wave, and so the question is settled, light is a wave. We know which wave, we have a full theory describing everything. And so at the turn of the century, many great physicists like Michelson, Lord Kelvin could say, everything is understood, physics is completed. We should not make fun of Lord Kelvin, because when you read the original text, and I have the original text, I can show you, he says everything is understood apart dark clouds. They are not small clouds, apart two dark clouds. And in order to get rid of these dark clouds, we will have to change very much physics. He was visionary, because the two dark clouds were, on the one hand, the negative result of the Michelson experiment, and we know that it was necessary to invent special relativity to understand this negative result. And the other one is about heat capacity at low temperature, and to understand the anomaly of heat capacity at low temperature, you need to invent quantum physics. This was the role of Einstein. So we should not make fun of Lord Kelvin. Okay, and so in the early 20th century, particles come back. Einstein, in a wonderful paper, has many arguments to say, I like to consider light as made of quanta, least quantum, which are elementary grains of energy with a value E equal h nu and momentum P equal h nu divided by C. I remind you that in 900 exactly, Planck had introduced what we call now the Planck constant in order to render an account of the blackbody radiation. But Planck had certainly not dare say that light is made of quanta. He had said you have to discretize the exchange of energy between radiation and matter in order to derive the formula which seems to reproduce the blackbody radiation. Planck had not dare say light is quantized. Einstein dare say light is made of quanta. And with this, he made quantitative prediction for the photoelectric effect. Everybody knows that. And the ideas of Einstein were not accepted. And they were not accepted at all. In 1913, Einstein was selected as a Prussian Academy of Science. And the report that we have in the archives writes, sometimes Einstein makes bad mistakes. Like, for instance, his story of least quantum. But he has already done so many good things that we are going to elect him anyway. This is an historical text. I can give you the reference. Okay? Anyway, when Millikan did his experiment in 1915, and Millikan, that you see here, he was president of Stanford at that time, when Millikan did the experiment, he says explicitly in his memoir that he embarked into this experiment to prove that Einstein was wrong. But Millikan was a good scientist, a good experimentalist, and he found that Einstein was right with the photoelectric effect. And then Einstein got the Nobel Award, not for the relativity, for his explanation of the photoelectric effect. We'll come back to that in a while. And then there were more and more evidence that you have to quantize radiation, for instance, it's a Compton effect in the X-ray domain. Now, of course, these people were not naive. They knew of Fresnel, Young. They knew that there are so many phenomena that you can describe with waves. How can you reconcile the particle description that they advocate here with typical wave phenomena like interference, diffraction, etc.? So, is it a particle or a wave? Einstein was obsessed by this problem. He came with the idea of least quantum in 1905, but in 1909, there is a famous Salzburg conference. If you want to know about it, type on Google Salzburg conference, and you will find the text either in German, if you are lucky enough to be able to read it in German, but there are translations in English. And there is a full series of reasoning, and the conclusion is always the same. Light is both a wave and a particle. I just give you a flavor. He is able to calculate fluctuations of blackbody radiation in the kind of reasoning that only Einstein was able to make. He has a vessel in which there is a gas, there is thermal radiation, there is a moving wall, and he imposes thermodynamics condition with that, and with this, at the end, he comes to be able to calculate the fluctuation of the density of energy in a band of dnu. And he finds two terms. Rho is the average density of energy, and this is fluctuation. The first term is what we call, in modern language, short noise. That is to say, I remind you, what he is calculating, he has a moving wall, and he calculates the fluctuation by calculating the effect of radiation on that moving wall. Okay? The radiation pressure has fluctuations. Okay? And the first term here is what would you would obtain by assuming that light is made of particles arriving at random with a Poisson distribution. Okay? These associated to fluctuation in the Poisson distribution. So it's what we call shot noise. It's the noise that you have if you have shots of particles. And the second term is the term that you would obtain by assuming that light is made of many waves, mutually incoherent. There are bit knots, but all these bit knots come with random phases, mutual random phases. And so when you look at the average density fluctuation due to all these waves, this is the second term. And you say, look, you have the sum of the two terms. It means that radiation is both a wave and a particle. In 1923, Louis de Broglie comes with a reverse statement. Thinking of particles like an electron, he says a particle is also a wave. So when I have a particle with a momentum p, then I have a wave with a wavelength lambda equal h divided by p, where h is still the Planck constant. Okay, this looks nice, wave-particle duality, but you know, when I was a student, and still now, I'm no longer a student unfortunately, but still now, when I look at that, I say, okay, easy to say the words, wave-particle duality. We can sing all together, wave-particle duality, wave-particle duality. But try to understand what it means, that something is both a wave and a particle. And I'm going to show you that it is not so simple to represent these notions by images. Before embarking into the difficulties, the conceptual difficulties of quantum mechanics, I would like to emphasize the amazing success of quantum mechanics, okay? Because then I'm going to say, okay, we have problems, but quantum mechanics has done a lot. It's by far the most successful physics theory ever. Because quantum mechanics has allowed us to understand the structure of matter, its properties. For instance, you know that in classical physics, there is no stable matter. Because matter is made of positive and negative charges, they attract each other, etc., etc. And the only way to understand that the positive and negative charge don't collapse on each other, it's because of quantum mechanics, which prevents, for instance, if you take an electron and a nucleus and a proton, if you would confine them in a too narrow dimension, it would demand a huge quantity of energy that you don't have. And this is why there is a limit in this collapse, okay? And so understanding the structure of matter, its properties, its interaction with light, all this is understood thanks to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics also allows to understand bizarre, exotic properties like superfluidity, supraconductivity, Bose-Einstein condensate, etc. And also it allowed engineers, well, physicists first and then engineers, to invent and develop new devices like laser, transistor, integrated circuits, that is to say, highway for information, that is to say, the modern society of information. Without a laser, without integrated circuit, there is no society of the information and communication. So, this being said, when you look carefully into what you have here, it's always quantum mechanics applied to large ensembles. Zillions of electrons in a transistor or integrated circuit, zillions of photons in a laser beam. Okay? It's always quantum mechanics applied to large ensembles. And everybody knows that quantum mechanics gives you statistical prediction. You can say, if I do that, the probability to observe the first result is this, the probability to observe another result is that, and when you apply it to large ensembles, no problem. But then you can ask the question, I want to ask the question, does this formalism work for a single particle, and what does it mean to apply statistical notions or statistical prediction to a single particle. And this is what I'm going to discuss here. And of course, when I was a student, we could look in textbooks like Feynman. Feynman textbook in the 1950s. But we have to know that these single photon experiments at that time were absolute Gedanken experiments. Nobody had done this experiment. Moreover, somebody as smart as Schrödinger has written in 1950, we don't experiment on single particle no more that the biologists raise dinosaurs in the next zoo. So these people thought that it's impossible to observe single quantum objects, and so they didn't dare ask the question, how do you apply quantum mechanics to a single object? But people like Feynman would anyway in textbook answer the question, although the experiment had not been done, and this is a kind of experiment that Feynman describes. He tells you, let us consider the Young-Holtz experiment, and we have a source here which emits particles one after the other one. They are well separated, okay? If I open only one hole here, and I scan my detector detects particles one after the other one, I can build a histogram with a probability of detection versus position, it's flat. Oh, maybe it was too fast. What happens? Okay, now, maybe I was too far. Now, if I have the two holes open, and I scan my detector, what do I observe? I observe that now the probability of detection has some maxima, minima, maxima, minima, and of course we know that. The only interpretation that we know is to say there is a wave, and the wave crosses passes the two holes simultaneously, and it's by recombining here, according to the path difference, either the two waves arrive in phase or out of phase, and when they arrive in phase it is a constructive interference, out of phase it's a negative interference, and we can understand that, okay? So, to understand that, we need to have a wave-like description. This, I say there was no experiment, actually, many people have tried to do experiments, but I am going to comment about these experiments. As soon as 1909, an English gentleman, an English aristocrat, Mr. Taylor, embarked into an experiment which consists of having a faint source, a needle, in a situation when you can observe the diffraction pattern around the needle. And he attenuates the light so much that it will take 6 months to register the pattern on a photo plate. And the reason why I mentioned that is that this man was a sailor. He has a yacht, you know, he was a yachtman. And so he liked physics, but he also liked sailing. So he sets his experiment, go on sailing for several months, come back. This is true, this is a true story. And processes the photo plate, and the fringes was there. And there is a full series of experiments. We all follow the same skill. You observe wave-like behavior in a situation where, if you calculate the average distance between the two successive photons, this average distance is so large that it's very unlikely to have two photons at the same time in the apparatus. Too far, no. So, can they safely claim that they have observed single particle interference? In the early 80s, I analyzed these experiments and came to the conclusion that absolutely not, for the following reason. In the 60s and 70s, quantum optics developed thanks to the formalism that Roy Glauber developed. And what we learned by Roy Glauber is that when you take a beam of light and you attenuate it, whatever the initial nature of light, once you have attenuated, it's safely described at what we call a coherent or a quasi-classical state of light. And this quasi-classical state of light, which, for those of you who can understand the words, is an eigenstate of the annihilation operator, it turns out that you can show that any measurement that you are going to make on such a quantum state it's strictly equivalent to what you can calculate with a classical electromagnetic field. In other words, this quasi-classical quantum state is the best approximation of what we learn in elementary courses as ideal, monochromatic wave, etc. Okay? And so, all properties of such light are well described as a wave model of light. You don't need the notion of photon. It is useless and irrelevant. And so, in these experiments where people attenuate, if we follow Glauber, it's nonsense to speak of photon, or there is no use of speak of photon. And then you're going to come back, look, what about the photoelectric effect? Don't we need the notion of least quantum? And then I'm going to argue. There is a simple model for those of you who teach quantum optics or elementary quantum mechanics. I recommend to develop this model. It's a model where you can perfectly describe the photoelectric effect, not quantizing light, but quantizing the detector. You assume that you have a detector with a ground state and a continuum of ionized state, and you assume that light is described by a classical field. And the ordinary Fermi golden rule or whatever technique, it's in my book, and if you ask me, I can send you for free the exercise, okay? But I did not invent it. You can demonstrate that you have all the properties of the photoelectric effect, where this model where, again, you quantize matter, but you don't quantize light. So what's wrong with Einstein? Nothing wrong. At the time of Einstein, in 1905, nothing was quantized. Neither light nor matter. I remind you, Bohr, 1913. It was before Bohr quantized matter. So at that time, the full classical description of the world could not render an account of the photoelectric effect. You have to quantize something, either light or matter. Einstein decided to quantize light. It was a good idea. He could have decided to quantize matter. It would have been a good idea also. So you see the situation. But in the modern perspective, the photoelectric effect doesn't force us to accept that we have to quantize light. Okay. So now, let us suppose I claim, I have a black box, and I tell you I have built a source emitting one photon after another one. I have built a source which emits well-separated photons. Could we make a test to prove that I am right? Yes. The idea is the following. Let us put one detector here, one photon detector here, and one photon detector here, and we put counters. Here I have a counter which tells me how many times I detected here. I have a counter which tells me how many times, let's say per second, I detect here. And I have a coincidence circuit. And the coincidence circuit will register something only if the two detectors fire simultaneously. What I claim is that if words have a meaning, if I have a single particle is pass either in hole 1 or in hole 2, but not simultaneously in both holes. Okay, a billiard ball will go either on one side or on the other side. So if I have really a single particle, there will never be any coincidence. Okay, so this would be a test. Of course, if I have a wave, you can predict the opposite behavior, because a wave, you will have a wavelet here, and this wavelet has a certain probability to find the detector, and the other one has a certain probability, and for a wave, you would observe a coincidence probability different from zero. Okay, believe it or not, but nobody thought to making this experiment before 1985. Why? Because when you think of electron, neutron, atom, molecules, people consider that the particle nature is obvious and only wave-like effects were searched. And in the case of faint light, particle-like behavior was considered obvious as soon as the average distance between photons was large. But, as I told you, this is absolutely questionable. So we can come to... Oops. We are going to progressively to go to a real experiment. Young's holes is not so nice in modern technology, so in modern technology we are rather going to use a beam splitter. So I'm going to rephrase the same reasoning with a beam splitter. Everybody knows what is a beam splitter. I could take a piece of glass, send my laser beam on it, a fraction would be reflected, fraction would be transmitted. So far, so good. If it is 50%, 50%, everybody understands half of the intensity on one side, half on the other side. If I think that there are zillions of photons, half of the photons on one side, half of the photons on the other side. But what if I have a single photon? Single photon will go either on one side or on the other side. And so again, if I have my coincidence circuit should tell me probability of coincidence equals 0. In contrast, if I have wave, the wave is cut in two here. I have a wavelet here, certain probability of detection, and a probability of coincidence which is different from 0. Now comes the equation. The answer of which is obvious for a mathematician, but not for a physicist. How to distinguish 0 from non-zero? Of course, mathematicians laugh. But for a physicist, it's totally different. So, you know, he's not a real mathematician. He begins to think of precision and things like that. Come on. My mathematics teacher told me 0 is different from anything else. But I am a physicist, okay? And so, you are perfectly right. If you want to come and work in my lab, everything is about precision. How to distinguish 0 from non-zero, let us talk about uncertainties, precision, etc. And now, we could make a reasoning with some sophisticated mathematical tool, a Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, that's a maximum, which is the following. Let us take a wave-like model in which the wave is split in two. The probability of joint detection will be proportional to the product of this by that, and the probability of detection here is proportional to the intensity of light, so the probability of joint detection is proportional to the square of the intensity. And then I have reflection coefficient, transmission coefficient, plus quantum efficiency. Okay, details. But the single probabilities are proportional to I on that side and I on the other side. And you see that these two formulas are almost equivalent, except that I have an average. Why do I have an average? Because it may fluctuate, okay? So in case it fluctuates, I consider average. And of course, these are consequence of the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, but of course you understand that. The average of the square is larger than or equal to the square of the average, okay? Everybody understand that, even simple-minded physicists, okay? But when you look at that, it tells you that the ratio of the joint detection to the product of the single probability detection should always be larger than or equal to 1. And now, I have a big difference between 0 and non-zero, because the difference is between 0 and 1. And even a physicist can understand that 0, and even a mathematician can understand that 0 and 1 are very different from each other. So, we have a criterion now. And with this criterion, we can think again of that experiment. We measure, and if I claim that I have a single particle, I should violate this. Because if I have this, it can only be a wave. Okay. So, this is the idea of the experiment. We have a criterion for a particle-like behavior. Alpha should be less than 1 to evidence a particle-like behavior. This kind of formula is now used in a standard way. There is a whole industry of single photon sources these days, and these people always use this criterion. They don't cite us, but it's not a problem. We invented this. This was the thesis of Philippe Grangier, who was my first PhD student, and we invented this criterion at that time. Okay. So, the first experiment we did, I hope will impress you. It's an experiment in which we attenuated a beam. We had a small light-emitting diode, emitting a pulse of a few nanoseconds, and we put the density attenuating by a factor of 10 to the 7th or 10 to the 8th or something like that, so that when you do the calculation, you come to the conclusion that in each pulse there is 10 to the minus 2 photon, 100th of a photon. What does it tell you? It tells you that basically almost all the time there is nothing, and from time to time there is one photon.
This is because 1.06
No, no. This just means that this is almost equal to 1 for a physicist. And what we find is that it has a value of 1, exactly the value that you predict for a classical wave. So although it looks that it's either 1 photon or 0, in spite of that, my claim based on Glauber's theorem that any attenuated beam behaves like a classical wave, you have a demonstration. But if I insist to understand it in terms of photons, I have also the answer in Glauber's. The answer is the following. If you insist for speaking of photon, in any interval of time, or space volume, you have a probabilistic distribution of particles, which is a Poisson distribution. Now let us consider a Poisson distribution with a parameter which is very small compared to 1. It means probability to have 0 is almost 1, 1 minus peanuts. Peanuts is the physicist variable of epsilon. So it's 1 minus peanuts, but the probability to have 1 is peanut, and the probability to have 2 in a Poisson distribution is peanut to the square, divided by factorial 2, but it's details, okay? And so, what happens is that in such a distribution, you have just enough, the number of pairs is not 0. It's just enough that from time to time, you have a pair arriving on the beam splitter, splits into 1 photon on the side, 1 photon on the other side, and you have a probability to have a joint detection. It's just when you do correctly your Poisson probability, etc., it's just you find alpha equal 1. So, okay, doesn't prove that. So, faint light is not made of single photons. And so the next question, are there means to produce single photon states of light? Can we demonstrate experimentally single particle behavior with such a source if we can invent one? And the answer is very simple. Whoops, sorry for that. It's a, I should go the other way. It's a recipe, you know, I like cooking also, so I like recipes. So it's a recipe. To produce a single photon, take a single emitter. Excited, single atom, single ion, single molecule. Excited and wait. It will deliver a single photon and only one. So there is a solution. But in the 1980s, nobody had ever been able to isolate a single emitter and to have a single emitter emitting light. And so the first experiment actually was done by Kimball, Dagenais, and Mandel. Well, in 1979, they made an experiment that we call anti-bunching, and the idea was the following. They had a thin, not dense at all, atomic beam. They observe with a microscope objective so that in the volume of observation there is one and only one atom. They excite the atom, look at the spontaneous photon which is emitted, and look for the second one. And they find that the probability to get a second photon with a certain delay after the first one, so the correlation function at 2 times, correlation function for observing at time t plus tau, this correlation function is 0 for tau equals 0. And this cannot be understood with classical physics because, again, Cauchy-Schwarz, in classical physics, an autocorrelation function of a function which is a positive function, because the intensity is always maximum at the origin. And here they observe a minimum at the origin, and so this was the first evidence of something which cannot be described by a classical wave. So they were able to isolate single atoms in space. Well, this is more technical. In our experiment with Philippe Grangier, we were able to isolate single atoms in time and not in space. And the reason is the following. I have built, for the Bell's inequality test, a source of pairs of photons. In other words, when I excite an atom here, it will emit a first green photon and a second violet photon. This is the lasers and everything, a very complicated device for producing that. And the point is that there are millions or billions of atoms emitting simultaneously. So I have the same problem of everybody. I cannot isolate. Yes, I can isolate for the following reason. I give you the orders of magnitude and you understand immediately. The average rate of excitation of cascades by all the atoms which is here, globally, it yields about 10 to the 6 to 10 to the 7 cascades per second. So 1 each microsecond. But now this cascade has a lifetime of 5 nanoseconds. And 5 nanoseconds is much shorter than the average time between the cascades. So if you think in time, what do you have? You have green-violet, silence. Green-violet, nothing. So if now I catch a green photon, I know that for the next 5 nanoseconds, I have a large probability to have one and only one photon, and the probability to have another cascade excited at the same time is very small. Small enough that you can make a calculation, it becomes negligible.
Because we have to look in time.
Yes, we isolate on the time. My age when I invented that was they have space and they isolate in space. I isolate on the time axis. Tac, tac, I isolate here. Because I have a signal. Today, this kind of source of single photon is called, unfortunately, we did not invent the name, heralded single photon source. The second photon is heralded by the detection of the first one. Okay? So with this, we did the experiment, and as soon as we did the experiment, we found alpha definitely smaller than many standard deviation. I remind you on the Higgs boson, it's only 6 standard deviation. Here it's, I don't know, tenths, yes, more than 10 standard deviation. So it's definitely smaller than 1. It means that it cannot be a classical wave. And so why is it not 0? It's not 0 because in the detector you have what you call a dark signal. Even if no light arrives on it, from time to time there is a signal, okay? Because of thermal excitation, etc. So this dark current at the end gives a certain rate of coincidence, but this rate of coincidence is small enough that it's well below the limit of 1. So with this, we are sure that we have produced something which is equivalent to a single photon. Okay, look at this experiment. 3 laser, atomic beam, vacuum chamber, etc. Awfully complicated. Now it's disgustingly simple. Now you take a microscope plate, you put some liquid on it with some molecules that you have well selected, very dilute, so that they are well separated, with what they call a confocal microscope. You look at one, you shine a laser beam on it, and you get one and only one photon. So nowadays you really literally take only one object. And so you have a scheme like that. My colleagues physicists recognize a 4-level system, like in a laser. So the laser excites here, and you get the single photon here, and you will re-excite again. Now, what is good in this system is that you excite in green, and the single photon is red. So you have what is called a dichroic mirror here. So you excite here, but you get the red photon through here. And so here you get something which is single photon, and here we have checked, and you have alpha very clearly less than 1. Okay? Okay. So it's a single particle behavior. Now, we had single particle, and we have now easily single particle. Let us revisit the question of, can we observe interference with a single photon? Now we know that we have really a single photon. So what we do is that we build what is called the Mach-Zehnder interferometer, a system in which you think of a wave. The wave is split in two, recombined here at the second beam splitter, and the recombination here and the recombination there will lead to interference. And the interference, you see it by the fact that when you move, for instance, this mirror, you change the path difference. So the state of interference here changes with the position of that mirror. So what you expect is a modulation of the probability of detection here and there as a function of the position of the mirror. We did the experiment with Philippe Grangier, so to make a long story short, just to show you that when you increase the time for observation, there is a miracle called signal-to-noise ratio increasing with time. And you see here, so the experiment is the following. We choose a difference in the path here, and we observe, we count. So here for 0.1 second, here for 1, here for 10 seconds. Then we slightly move, we count again. Slightly move, count again. And you see that the probability of detection has a full modulation and on the other channel you have a full modulation, and as it should be for conservation of energy or probability of whatever you want, the sum of the two is strictly constant. Okay? But you have an unambiguous wave-like behavior here. Oh, this is a beautiful interferometer that was built by the workshop at Institut d'Optique. You have a beautiful here unambiguous wave-like behavior with the source of single photon. We are going to think about that. But before that, I want to show you the modern version of that experiment. Because nowadays we have computers, video. I don't resist the pleasure to play a movie. I will try. You know, it's the first time I'm using a Macintosh, so we will see how it works. So what do we do? In this experiment, rather than having a beam splitter, we have Fresnel biprism. That is to say, here we have our beam, but if the words have a meaning, there is one photon and only one in that beam. So here I have a prism deflecting light here, another prism deflecting light here. If there is one and only one photon, it will be detected either here or there. We do it, and we observe indeed that it is detected either here or there. We always play the same game, compare the probability of joint detection to single probability. It goes either here or there. Then what do? We move the detector and we put it here. And now you recombine the two beams, and according to Fresnel, we should observe in different ranges. And here we have a CCD camera, and the CCD camera allows us to detect any single photon arriving on the detector. So I'm going to show it, if it won't work. Okay, now. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's here. So what you are going to have here is the detector, and you are going to see each photon arriving on the detector. Can we dim the light? I'm not sure that it will be... Is there anybody to dim the light? On peut atténuer les lumières ou pas? Okay, can you see here? Can you see the various photons arriving? Okay, and look progressively what happens. Here what we do is we sum along vertical lines. So you have here the sum along vertical lines. Okay? So it's a probability to be in a slice here. And you see progressively that the photons arrive one after one, but they accumulate here, they don't accumulate here, they accumulate here. This is done with a real single photon source, okay? It's not just with an attenuated lazy beam as they show usually. This one was done with a single photon source. Look how it is beautiful. Let us go to the end of the show. The end of the show, it's even more beautiful. Look at that. It's absolutely gorgeous. Okay. So with this, what have we done now? Qu'est-ce qu'il faut que je fasse ici? Comme ça. Voilà. So we have observed fringes in the overlap. So we have an unambiguous wave-like behavior in the single photon region. Okay. So it's time to think a little more about what we have done. Let us talk about the Grangier experiment. In the first experiment, there is no doubt that to understand that let us think that the experiment, the ideal, there is no noise, etc. In the ideal experiment, no coincidence, so there is something which goes either on one side or on the other side. Okay? This is the only logical conclusion of the fact that the probability of coincidence is zero. But in the second experiment, the fact that the probability of detection depends on the difference between the two paths can be interpreted only as the fact that there is a wave which is split in two, recombined. But look, it's the same source, the same beam splitter. Everything is the same here in the first part. So we have contradictory images. There is the same thing, but in one experiment, it goes either on one side or the other one. In the other experiment, it goes on both sides simultaneously. In case of despair, try to look Bohr. And if you look into Niels Bohr, he will tell you, but look, my young friend, well, that time when I was young, okay, he would have said, look, my old friend, the two experiments are incompatible. You have to choose a equation. Either you ask the equation, which way does the particle go, either this way or the other way, or you ask the equation, Does it behave like a wave, and does it make an interference? But you cannot ask the two questions simultaneously. There is no way to invent an apparatus which would combine this measurement and that measurement. You have to choose between the two pieces of equipment. And if you look carefully into more, it will tell you, you know, in the quantum world, the properties that you observe depend on the question that you ask. You cannot isolate the system from the measuring apparatus, and the measuring apparatus participates to the answer that you have. And so you say, I understand that. When the photon arrives here, it says, this is an accident. And I know that I must behave like a wave. But when it arrives here, you say, I know what they are doing. Now I will behave like a particle. Well, if you think of the meaning of the words, depends on the kind of apparatus. The apparatus determines the kind of answer to the question. What I say is just a funny way of saying what you can think. And then comes Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler was full of humor. Okay, he has a wonderful sense of humor. And Wheeler say, you know, you are not forced to decide between this and that when the photon arrives here. You could keep it behind you back. And so when the photon arrives here, he doesn't know. This is a so-called Wheeler's delayed choice experiment. That is an experiment in which, when the photon arrives here, you have not yet decided between this and that. And so I'm going to describe the Wheeler's delayed choice. Our end with that. So, what we have done is slightly, in the spirit of Wheeler, slightly modify the Which-Way experiment in the following way. I remove the two detectors and I put the two detectors, but I back them. So, but you know, there is nothing here. So basically nothing is changed. You are still looking for coincidence here and trying to observe that there is no coincidence. But if you want to look for interference, you have just to introduce a beam splitter. And you know, removing or introducing the beam splitter can be done just by electronic devices at the nanosecond scale, with electro-optics devices and stuff like that. Okay, so this, and of course, now we want to make the choice after the photon passes the first beam splitter. So this theorist view is a drawing by Wheeler himself. He tells you the wave packet, whatever it means, arrives on the beam splitter and begins to propagate in the two arms. And here you have the delay choice, either not to put anything or to put beam splitter. Okay, that's Wheeler's vision. And this is our vision, the real experiment which has been done. It's a beautiful interferometer, 50 meters long, 48 meters long. Here we separate the two beams. They propagate for 48 meters, and we recombine them. And because we play with polarization, here we have a device which can turn polarization at the nanosecond scale, and we can choose by applying or not applying voltage here, either to recombine the two beams here, or to let one pass and the other pass. And what we have here, and this is the beauty of the experiment, is we call it pompously, but we did not invent, but everything called it that way, a quantum random noise generator, which means that we have what we claim is a quantum phenomenon which selects the fact that we apply or we do not apply the voltage. But the important thing is that the decision is made here when the photon is about in the middle. Okay? And so, when the photon arrives here, there is no way for the photon to know what will be the state when it will arrive on the other side. It's, in the sense of relativity, what we call space-like separate event. There cannot be any causal relation between the events. Okay. So we did the experiment, and to make, well, unfortunately, there was no surprise. Physicists like to be surprised, okay? But there was no surprise. You see, so what we do the experiment and we sort out the results. There are the case where the beam splitter was in, the case where it was not in. Here I show the result when the beam splitter was in, have a beautiful modulation, beautiful interference rate. By the way, people who know optics will appreciate it. 94% visibility, with an interferometer 50 meters long, and a source which is not coherent. Okay, it's fluorescence light. It has a width. Okay, you have to go around 0 phase difference, etc. It's like white light fringes. Achieve such a visibility for people who know optics. Well, these are students who have done that, of course, not me. Okay, this is why I say that it is an absolute tour de force. Okay, and then when in the case where the beam splitter is not, of course, there is no interference, of course, because I told you we find what we expect. And in addition, we can check that for this experiment, if we introduce a block here, then it's detected only here, and if we introduce a block there, it's detected only here, which means, again, it's another proof that it behaves like a particle. Okay. So what we can say is that the photon travels one route or the other, and we can tell which one in this situation when the beam splitter is not there. Okay. And the reason why I cite this is because Wheeler anticipated that in case we observe, he did not see, unfortunately, the result of this experiment, which was done recently, but Wheeler had written that if we observe what quantum mechanics allow us to predict, we will have to say that one decides that the photon shall have come by one route or by both routes after it has already done its travel. So you decide to go either one route or both routes when the travel is finished. That's the only logical conclusion. What can we do with that? Well, first, a few remarks. Quantum optics formalism gives a coherent account of it. I mean, the problem comes when we have images. When we see, I like images. I cannot do physics without images. But I have to acknowledge that the problem comes only because of images. The formalism itself of quantum optics, as you can learn it into my book, okay, doesn't demand to use one or the other one. It's a full integrated formalism. The same equation predicts the result of the first experiment and of the second experiment. You don't have to change equations, okay? This is important. In a sense, Bohr's complementarity allows us to avoid too strong inconsistencies, but this experiment shows that complementarity should not be interpreted in a too naive way. In particular, in elementary books of quantum mechanics, they tell you there is a famous Heisenberg microscope, that it is the effect of the measuring apparatus that it's not at all. It's more subtle than that. Complementarity in quantum mechanics is not just mechanical interaction with the equipment. Now, I would like in the last 2 minutes to tell you that questioning the foundation of quantum mechanics is not only an academic issue. Clarifying the concept of single photon has led to quantum cryptography. To be fair, also the question of entanglement. And so I just flash from fundamental test to application. The famous quantum cryptography. It's well known by people who do cryptography. There is a theorem, mathematical theorem by Shannon, which tells you that if Alice and Bob have two identical copies of the series of 1 and 0, you can encode the message and decode the message, and there is no possibility for the eavesdropper here to decipher, provided that the message is not longer than the key. So the problem is to exchange the key between Alice and Bob, and if they are able, if Alice has a key, an encoding key, and if she's able to send to Bob the value of the key, then they keep the two keys until the moment when they want to exchange the message. The question is, when she sends the message, cannot Eve intercept the information? And it is at this point that quantum mechanics plays a game. Because let's suppose you use single photon and Eve is here. Now, if Eve is observing here, it has to take the single photon. And so there is a way by doing a statistical analysis to know that there is a spy on the line. So that's the basic idea of this kind of quantum cryptography, which is due to a scheme by Gilles Brassard and Charles Bennett, the Bennett and Brassard BB84. Okay. So there are plenty of applications, including, well, this was in NSK Charge, Jean-François Roch and Philippe Grangier. And you can either, my friend Nicolas Gisin, there is a spin-off of his lab, and they can exchange money by quantum money. Well, it's for money, it's the bankers. The bankers do not want the Internal Revenue Service to look into the accounts, okay? So the exchange between banks in Geneva, Lyon, and Lausanne by quantum cryptography, you can buy one if you want. Well, Nicolas Gizen is also proud because, you know, there are many votations in Swiss. And he has convinced the authorities that to transmit data from a bureau de vote to the central bureau, they also transmit the result of the votation with that system. Anyway. So, well, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so to conclude, what we have seen here, one of the great quantum mysteries has been experimentally demonstrated, but asking fundamental questions may lead to applications, and, well, these other, but I have no time. Here, the only thing I want to show you is that there was a beautiful team for this experiment. You are going to see why it is a beautiful team, because you have these people, more or less young, and behind the curtain, you have the godfather of the experiment. And the reason why I like that is because Philippe Grangier was my first PhD student, Jean-François Roch was the first PhD student of Philippe Grangier, and this guy was the first PhD student. I cannot even count the number of generations that we have on this. Basis of 2 is not enough, okay? And with this, I thank you, and if you want to ask questions, sorry, I was a little too long, but...
spectacular lecture, so I should say, maybe to describe it in one word, it was maybe the most enlightening that I've ever been. Thank you very much. Are there questions?
Alan wants to ask questions, but he knows that he asks a hard question, and we ask a hard question.
You will speak afterwards.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
Is there a mathematical way to make the complementary principle precise, say in the language of probability field? A mathematical way to make it precise, the principle.
So it's a question. Is there a mathematical way? Well, as far as I understand mathematics, you cannot do it with ordinary probability. That is, you say, if you only consider things with ordinary probability, it doesn't work. It doesn't follow ordinary logic that you represent by ordinary probabilities. What you have to do is to combine amplitudes, and the probabilities that we have at the end, which are the probability of observing this or that, are square modulus of these complex numbers. And this is why it does not follow the usual rule of the game of probability for real world, for usual world. So, but again, as I said, the formalism is absolutely consistent. For people who want to be a little more technical, what we have is that we have the second quantification formalism, in which we replace numbers by operator, a dagger and a, which do not commute, etc. And then the formalism is absolutely consistent. Once you have done that, you can, well, I can show you just one equation on the blackboard. If I have a state with one and only one photon here, if I look at the probability for detecting once, this annihilation operated, apply to that square modulus. And this has a value which is something. Let's say 1 if I have normalized, or which is something, okay? But now if I want to detect twice a single photon, what happens? Detecting twice means that I apply 2 times the annihilation operator. And when I apply 1 time, I should have written here, when I apply 1 time the annihilation operator, it gives me the state 0, but the state 0 is a state. It has a modulus. It's not. But when I apply again on the state 0, I get the number 0. This is the basis of formalism. And so here, I apply 2 times to this. So I can detect once, but if I can't detect a second time, I get the number 0. So mathematically, there is absolutely no difficulty in showing that if I send 1 and only 1 photon, the meaning of that means that I have been able to produce a state of the light which is an eigenstate of the number of the observable number of photons. It's what is called a Fock state. While ordinary light is not an eigenstate of the number of photons. The number of photons is not well defined. This is why I have a Poisson distribution. So it's just to tell you that we understand perfectly well the formalism. Again, I hope to have explained it well in the book.
I think the good thing about CEMPI is also that we've got more money than just peanuts, so we may be able to buy your book for lots of participants.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions
Yes.
or comments?
Yes.
I have one question. So you have described many experiments in which you take ensembles of identical initial conditions. I believe there are still people worrying about the collapse of the wave function issue, in which you take one experiment once with one single Poisson state. What is your personal opinion on this question?
Well, it's a different question.
Yeah.
No, but I think, well, I've written several times, and if you look onto my, well, I want to show you something here. Yeah, there are plenty of things of document about the single photon experiment in my homepage here, including I have authorization by my publisher to have the chapter of my book describing this experiment with a calculator. So you can have it for free. Okay? And I've written, what you will find here, for instance, I have the introduction to the set of papers of John Bell and my view of the development of quantum physics in the last part of, let's say, the second part of the last third of the 20th century is the following. The big change was, again, being able to observe single quantum objects. And it's exactly your question. And we have to acknowledge, of course, if I do it only once, I have one result. I cannot do probability on a single result. But being able to repeat many times the same experiment, same means I do all my best to make it the same, okay? With a single quantum object is something that even Schrödinger could not even dream of it, okay? And we have learned a lot about quantum mechanics by doing these experiments. For instance, for those of you who know about Bell's inequality test, it was one single pair of photons, and I look at the correlation. Another pair of photons, I look at the correlation. It's not large ensembles. It's always about single quantum object. The single object is, in that case, a single photon. In the case of pair, it's a single pair. And the amazing thing is that we had all the equations. But applying this equation to the case of the single object is much more bizarre than applying to a large ensemble, because a large ensemble, you're not surprised to have probability at the end. So, I don't know if I answer your question, but it allows me to emphasize the fact that here we are at the heart of quantum mechanics.
No, I agree, of course, but my question is, how do you feel as a physicist about the fact that it is not possible to predict the outcome of a single experiment on a single object?
Well, the physicist has to accept what nature tells us, that is to say we do the best experiment we can, and then I look at the result. And what I observe is two things. First, the result of the experiment is perfectly described by the mathematical formalism on the one hand. Second, if I insist on having images, and I need images, because if I have no image, I cannot invent no kind of experiment. My image have to be bizarre. That is to say, in my personal image, what I accept is non-locality. That is to say, I accept that my image, if you ask me my personal image, the wave packet arrives on the beam splitter, is split in two parts. The two parts travel. But when I detect here, immediately, non-locally, faster than light, this wave packet is collapsed to zero. That's my personal image. And I know that by using this image, I can make reasonable intuitive prediction, but of course, if I invent something strange, at the end, I do the full calculation to be sure that my intuition based on this strange image works. This is my personal image.
I think probably what Stefan is thinking of is something more deeper. Are you satisfied with this status of quantum mechanics? Or do you take a view as Einstein that we have to look for something deeper?
No, but I think any scientist would agree that we have to look for something else. Nobody has decided that science is finished. if I would tell you I'm satisfied, it would mean that science is finished. I don't think that science
No,
is
because
finished.
there is a view that people say that just
No, when you discuss deeply with them, they tell you, look, it depends if we are thinking of the big picture, if we are talking of what we do every day in our lab. It's very likely that what we do every day in our lab can be described satisfactorily with quantum mechanics that we do, but I think that no real physicist will tell you, I'm sure that for centuries it will be like that. So we tried to find something here, we did not find it. It still works. It's amazing that it works in so strange situation. And Bell's inequality evaluation is even more stranger than that. So it works.
I think this is a very good note.
I apologize to
because it would be bad for an inaugural conference of a center if science was finished. So I think